The evening rain poured down on Fifth Avenue as Nicholas Vaughan rushed from his office building to his waiting car. At 45 years old, he had everything money could buy: a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a fleet of luxury cars, and more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. His steel-grey hair and designer suit projected power and success, but his eyes were cold and distant, hardened by years of ruthless business deals. "Mr. Vaughan, the board meeting is in 20 minutes, his assistant called out, hurrying behind him with an umbrella. "Cancel it," Nicholas barked, checking his phone. Another acquisition deal was about to close, adding millions more to his empire. He never slowed down, never looked back. That's how he had built Vaughan Enterprises into a global powerhouse. The sound of small feet splashing through puddles barely registered until a tiny voice pierced through the rain. "Wait, mister, wait!" Nicholas turned, irritated at the interruption. Through the misty rain, he saw a small figure, a little girl no more than 8 years old standing barefoot on the wet sidewalk. She wore an oversized coat that hung off her thin frame, and a worn beanie covered what appeared to be a bald head. Her cheeks were sunken, but her eyes, there was something about those eyes that made him pause. Before he could react, she stumbled forward on unsteady legs. His hand shot out instinctively to catch her, but instead of falling, she gently took his hand and pressed a soft kiss to it. Nicholas yanked his hand back as if burned. "What are you doing?" The little girl smiled weakly, swaying slightly. "I just wanted to know what it felt like." What felt like?" he demanded, though something in her face made his voice softer than intended. "My mommy told me that when daddies love their little girls, they give them goodnight kisses," she said dreamily, her voice barely audible above the rain. "But I never got one, and the doctors said I don't have much time left, so I thought, maybe just once." Nicholas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Something about her face, the shape of her nose, the curve of her mouth, struck him with devastating familiarity. Who is your mother?" he asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. The little girl's eyes met his. "My mommy's name was Emily Carter. She died last month." The world stopped spinning. Emily Carter. The name hit him like a physical blow. Memories he'd buried years ago came rushing back. Her gentle smile, her quiet strength, the way she'd begged him to stay when his ambition had pulled him away. She'd written him letters afterward, dozens of them, all returned unopened. He'd been too focused on building his empire to read them. Now standing before him in the rain was the daughter he never knew existed. His daughter. And she was dying. "I'm Sarah," the little girl said softly, wavering on her feet. "The nurses at the hospital let me come to the park sometimes. I saw your picture in a magazine and you look just like Mommy said." Nicholas reached out to steady her, his hands trembling. "Where is your guardian? Who brought you here?" "Mrs. Thompson from the children's ward." "She's over there." Sarah pointed to an elderly nurse watching anxiously from under the awning of a nearby building. "She said I couldn't stay long because of my treatment, but I just wanted—" Her voice trailed off as her legs gave way. Nicholas caught her before she could fall, lifting her small body into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel the fever burning through her thin clothes. "I need to get you back to the hospital," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah's head rested against his shoulder, her eyes fluttering closed. "That was nice," she whispered. "Warmer than I thought it would be." Nicholas felt tears burning his eyes for the first time in decades. All his wealth, all his power, and he'd failed the two people who should have mattered most. But maybe it wasn't too late, not completely. He carried Sarah to his car, barking orders at his driver to take them to the hospital. As they drove, he held her close, finally giving her the first of what he promised himself would be many goodnight kisses. "I'm so sorry," he whispered against her forehead. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Sarah smiled, faintly in her half-sleep. "That's what I wished for," she murmured. "Every birthday candle, every shooting star." In that moment, Nicholas Vaughan, the man who had everything, realized he had nothing that truly mattered. But as he held his dying daughter, he made a silent vow. He would move heaven and earth to save her, and he would spend the rest of his life making up for lost time. The rain continued to fall outside as his car sped through the city streets. But inside, something frozen in Nicholas's heart had finally begun to thaw. The children's ward at Mount Sinai Hospital was a world Nicholas had never known existed. The halls were painted with cheerful murals of animals and rainbows, but they couldn't hide the serious faces of doctors and nurses rushing between rooms. As he sat beside Sarah's bed, watching her sleep, the beeping of monitors reminded him how fragile her life was. "Mr. Vaughn?" A gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Rachel Martinez stood in the doorway, holding Sarah's medical charts. "We need to discuss your daughter's condition." Nicholas followed the doctor to her office, his heart pounding. The room was small and cluttered with medical books and children's drawings, nothing like the sleek boardrooms he was used to. "Sarah has acute lymphoblastic leukemia," Dr. Martinez explained, her voice kind but direct. "She's been fighting it for the past 2 years. Emily, her mother, brought her here when they first discovered it, but the treatments are expensive. They did everything they could with the resources they had." Nicholas gripped the arms of his chair. "Money is no object. Now, whatever she needs, I'll pay for it. Mr. Vaughn, it's not that simple. The cancer has spread, the standard treatments haven't worked, and she's too weak for more aggressive options." Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "There is one possibility, an experimental treatment in Switzerland. But it's risky and there's no guarantee it will work. Book it, immediately." Nicholas pulled out his phone, ready to make calls. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "Sarah, she's a very special child. Despite everything she's been through, she never complains. The other children love her. She reads to them when they're scared, shares her toys, tells them stories. The nurses call her their little angel." Nicholas felt his throat tighten, just like Emily, always thinking of others first. Back in Sarah's room, he found Mrs. Thompson, the nurse who had brought Sarah to see him, adjusting her IV. "She's been asking about you every day since she saw your picture," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "Emily used to read her business magazines, showing her articles about you. She never said anything bad, just that Sarah's daddy was out there, building the important things." Nicholas looked at his sleeping daughter, remembering Emily's last letter, the one he'd returned unopened 8 years ago. How different would things have been if he'd just read it? Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy? You're still here?" The word daddy hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't deserve it, but he would spend every remaining moment trying to. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here." He took her small hand in his. "How are you feeling?" "Tired but happy," she smiled weakly. "Will you tell me a story? Mommy used to tell me stories about when you were young." Nicholas pulled his chair closer. "What kind of stories did she tell you?" "About how you used to work at a gas station to pay for college, and how you'd bring her wildflowers because you couldn't afford real ones." Sarah's eyes sparkled despite her fatigue. "She said you were the smartest, most determined person she'd ever met." Each word was like a knife in his heart. Emily had painted him as a hero to their daughter when he'd been anything but. "Sarah, honey, I need to tell you something." Nicholas took a deep breath. "We're going to take a trip. There are doctors in Switzerland who might be able to help. You get better. Would you like that?" Sarah's face lit up. "Like a real vacation? I've never been on an airplane before." "Yes, like a real vacation. And when you're feeling stronger, we'll go anywhere you want. Can we go to Disney World? Mommy always said we'd go someday. We'll go to every Disney park in the world," Nicholas promised, meaning every word. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was Marcus Chen, his chief financial officer. "Sir, the Beijing deal, they're backing out. We need you here for the emergency board meeting." For the first time in his life, Nicholas Vaughn didn't care about a business deal. "Handle it," he said, and turned off his phone. Sarah had drifted off again, but her hand still held his tightly. On the bedside table, he noticed a worn photo album. Opening it carefully, he found pictures of Emily and Sarah throughout the years. Birthdays, Christmases, first day of school. All the moments he should have been there for. One photo made him pause. Emily in a hospital bed, holding newborn Sarah. She looked tired but radiant and so young. They had both been young when they met in college. He'd been a scholarship student with big dreams, and she'd believed in him completely. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had turned into an obsession that pushed everything else aside. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A young boy in a wheelchair peeked in, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Is Sarah awake?" he whispered. "She promised to finish reading me Charlotte's Web today." "She's sleeping right now," Nicholas replied gently. "But maybe I could read it to you." The boy's face brightened. "Really? Sarah said you're her daddy. She said you were really busy, doing important things, but that someday you'd come see her." Nicholas felt tears threatening again. "Well, I'm not too busy anymore. Would you like to hear the story?" As he read to the young boy, other children gradually appeared in the doorway, wheeling IV poles or holding their parents' hands. Soon, he had an audience of 5 young patients, all listening intently as he read about Charlotte and Wilbur. Looking around at their innocent faces, then back at his sleeping daughter, Nicholas realized that all the board meetings and business deals in the world couldn't compare to this moment. He had spent years chasing success, but real wealth had been waiting here all along in a children's hospital room, holding his daughter's hand. The news of Nicholas Vaughan's sudden disappearance from the business world spread like wildfire. Speculation ran wild in the financial papers. Was he sick? Had there been a scandal? Nobody knew that the famous billionaire was spending his days in a hospital room, reading children's books and learning how to be a father. "The board is demanding answers," Victoria Stone, his personal assistant for the past decade, said as she visited him at the hospital. She stopped short when she saw him sitting cross-legged on the floor, helping Sarah put together a puzzle. "Then give them answers," Nicholas replied without looking up. "Tell them I'm taking a leave of absence for personal reasons." Victoria's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her tablet. "Nick, be reasonable. The company's stock has dropped 15% since you disappeared. The Beijing deal fell through. People are nervous." Sarah looked up from her puzzle, her face concerned. "Daddy, are you in trouble because of me?" Nicholas pulled her into a gentle hug. "No, sweetheart. Nothing is more important than you." Victoria watched the scene with a mixture of shock and something else. Was it jealousy? She and Nicholas had been dancing around a potential relationship for years. Now this sick child had appeared out of nowhere and completely changed the man. She thought she knew. "We're leaving for Switzerland next week," Nicholas told Victoria. "I need you to handle things here." "Switzerland?" Victoria's voice rose slightly. "Nick, you can't just abandon everything you've built." Sarah started coughing, a harsh, racking sound that shook her tiny frame. Nicholas held her until the spell passed, then helped her back into bed. Only when Sarah had fallen asleep did he step into the hallway with Victoria. "I already abandoned what mattered most," he said quietly. "I won't make that mistake again." After Victoria left, Nicholas sat beside Sarah's bed, watching her sleep. The door opened quietly, and Mrs. Thompson came in with a fresh IV bag. "You've given her such hope," the nurse said softly as she worked. "But there's something you should know. Emily tried to contact you when she first got sick. She called your office dozens of times." Nicholas felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "What?" "Your assistant always said you were too busy." After a while, Emily stopped trying. Mrs. Thompson's kind face was stern now. She worked 3 jobs to pay for Sarah's treatments. She cleaned houses during the day, waited tables at night, and still found time to read to Sarah every evening. Nicholas remembered all the times Victoria had protected his time, screening his calls, keeping distractions away. How many of those calls had been Emily, desperately trying to reach him about their dying daughter? A commotion in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. A group of doctors rushed past, heading for the room of Tommy, the little boy who loved Charlotte's Web. Through the open door, Nicholas could see the medical team working frantically, could hear the urgent beeping of machines. Sarah woke up, her eyes filling with tears. "Is Tommy okay?" Nicholas held her hand. "The doctors are helping him, sweetheart. He was scared about his operation today," Sarah whispered. "I promised I'd read to him after, but I was too tired." Hours later, they learned that Tommy had pulled through. Nicholas found himself thanking God, something he hadn't done in years. Looking at the children in the ward, some getting better, some getting worse, all fighting so hard, He felt ashamed of how he'd spent his life chasing things that now seemed meaningless. That night, as he sat in the darkness of Sarah's room, his phone lit up with a text from Marcus Chen. Emergency situation. Hunter Gray trying hostile takeover. Need you back immediately. Nicholas looked at his sleeping daughter, remembered Emily working 3 jobs to save their child, while he'd been in his corner office making millions. The choice was easy. Handle it, he texted back, then turned off his phone again. The next morning, Dr. Martinez brought the test results they'd been waiting for. Sarah's condition had stabilized enough for travel. The Swiss clinic was ready to receive them. "Sarah," Nicholas said gently, waking her. "Remember that trip we talked about? We're going next week." Sarah's face lit up, then fell. "But what about my friends here who will read to Tommy?" "I've thought about that." Nicholas pulled out a tablet. "We can video chat with them every day, and I've hired a professional storyteller to come read to the children while you're gone." "Really?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Can she read the voices?" "Like you do. You do the best Templeton voice in Charlotte's Web." Nicholas laughed, remembering how he'd spent hours practicing different voices for the characters, determined to get them right for his daughter. "Nobody does Templeton better than me, kiddo." Just then, Victoria burst into the room, her usual composure gone. "Nick, turn on the TV now." He grabbed the remote and flipped to a news channel. His stomach dropped as he saw the headline, "Vaughan Enterprises in Crisis. Board moves to remove CEO." The reporter was saying something about shareholder confidence and leadership vacuum, but Nicholas barely heard it. He was watching Sarah's face, seeing her worry that she was causing problems for him. "It's okay, Daddy," she said bravely. "Maybe you should go back to work. I'll be okay here." Nicholas pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "No, sweetheart. I'm exactly where I need to be." Victoria made an exasperated sound. "Nick, you're about to lose everything you've worked for." Nicholas looked at his daughter, then back at Victoria. "No," he said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I'm about to get everything that really matters." Later that night, as Sarah slept, Nicholas pulled out the photo album again. He found a picture of Emily graduating from nursing school, her face glowing with pride. He remembered how she'd given up her dreams of becoming a doctor to support his ambitions. She'd believed in him so completely, and he'd betrayed that faith. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm so sorry, Emily. But I promise you, I'll make it right. I'll be the father she deserves, the man you always believed I could be." Outside the window, the lights of New York City twinkled like stars. Somewhere in those streets, he'd lost his way, had forgotten what really mattered. But here, in this quiet hospital room watching his daughter sleep, Nicholas Vaughan had finally found his way home. The private jet touched down in Zurich on a crisp autumn morning. Sarah pressed her face against the window, her eyes wide with wonder at her first time seeing the Swiss Alps. Nicholas watched her, memorizing every expression of joy on her face. "It looks like a fairy tale," Sarah whispered as their car wound through the mountain roads toward the clinic. "Like the book you read me about Heidi." The Hoffman Institute stood at the end of a long private drive, its modern building nestled against the mountainside. It looked more like a luxury resort than a hospital, but its reputation as a pioneer in experimental cancer treatments had given Nicholas hope. Dr. Klaus Weber, the institute's director, met them personally. He was a tall man with kind eyes and silver hair, speaking English with a gentle German accent. "Welcome, Miss Sarah," he said, kneeling to her level. "We've prepared a special room for you with a view of the mountains." Sarah's room was bright and cheerful, with walls painted in soft yellows and a large window overlooking the Alps. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, though it was only November. "I heard you might miss Christmas at home," Dr. Weber explained, "so we thought we'd bring Christmas early." Sarah's face lit up, but Nicholas could see how the journey had tired her. She fell asleep almost as soon as they got her settled in bed. While she slept, Dr. Weber explained the treatment plan. "The therapy we're proposing is very new," he said carefully. "We've seen promising results, but you must understand there are no guarantees." "What are her chances?" Nicholas asked, his voice rough. "With traditional treatments, less than 10%. With our experimental protocol, perhaps 30%, but every case is different, 30%. Nicholas had never gambled on anything with such poor odds, but this wasn't a business deal, this was his daughter's life. When do we start? First, we must build up her strength. The treatment is very aggressive. It will be hard on her body. That evening, as Nicholas sat beside Sarah's bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. He'd been avoiding looking at news from home, but the headline made his blood run cold. Victoria Stone named interim CEO of Vaughan Enterprises. A video clip showed Victoria at a press conference, wearing the red power suit she saved for her biggest victories. While Nicholas Vaughan deals with personal matters, the board has asked me to step in and provide stable leadership, she was saying. I want to assure our shareholders that Vaughan Enterprises remains strong. Nicholas felt a cold fury building inside him. Victoria had been positioning herself for this all along. Every time she'd urged him to return to work, every concerned look about his abandonment of the company, it had all been calculated. His phone rang, Marcus calling. Nicholas stepped into the hallway to answer. She's orchestrated a complete takeover, Marcus said without preamble. She's been meeting secretly with the board for weeks, convincing them you're having some kind of breakdown. She's even got Hunter Gray supporting her now. What about my shares? She can't take control without them. Nick, she's using your power of attorney. The one you gave her 3 years ago when you were in that coma after your car accident. It was never revoked. Nicholas remembered. He'd been unconscious for 2 weeks after a crash in his Ferrari. Victoria had handled everything, had protected his interests. He'd trusted her completely. Fight it, he said. Use every lawyer we have. There's more, Marcus said hesitantly. She's been talking to reporters, hinting at things about you and her, suggesting your personal matter might be rehab or a mental health crisis. The stock is actually up since she took over. Through the door's window, Nicholas could see Sarah stirring in her sleep. None of it mattered. Not the company, not the money, not Victoria's betrayal. His daughter needed him. Keep fighting it, he told Marcus. But quietly, I can't leave Switzerland. Right now. When he went back into the room, Sarah was awake. Daddy, are you okay? You look worried. Nicholas forced a smile. Just boring grown-up stuff, sweetheart. How are you feeling? A little scared, she admitted. But Mommy always said being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you do what you have to do anyway. Nicholas felt tears sting his eyes, Emily's wisdom coming from their daughter's mouth. Your mummy was very smart. She kept all your letters, you know, Sarah said softly, in a box under her bed. She used to read them when she was sad. Nicholas felt his heart stop. My letters? The ones you wrote in college. She said that's when you loved her the most, before you got rich and important. Before he could respond, a nurse came in to start Sarah's evening medications. Nicholas excused himself, needing a moment alone. In the hallway, he met another parent, a woman about his age, with tired eyes and a kind smile. Your first night. Here, she asked. Nicholas nodded. I'm Grace. My son Michael has been here 3 months. She gestured to a room down the hall. The first few weeks are the hardest, but Dr. Weber, he works miracles sometimes. Sometimes Grace's smile faltered slightly. We lost 2 children last month, but 3 went home cancer-free. We hold on to those victories. Nicholas looked back, now through the window at Sarah, who was showing the nurse her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear that had belonged to Emily as a child. When my husband left us, Grace said quietly, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. Then Michael got sick, and I realized sometimes life's biggest blessings come disguised as its worst moments. Michael's illness taught me what really matters. Nicholas thought about Victoria, about his company slipping away. A year ago, it would have destroyed him. Now it seemed trivial. I spent 20 years building an empire, he said, but I forgot. To build a life, Grace patted his arm. It's never too late to start. Back in Sarah's room, the nurse had finished with the medications. Sarah was fighting sleep, trying to keep her eyes open. Tell me about Mommy, she said drowsily. What was she like when you met her? Nicholas pulled his chair closer to the bed. She was the kindest person I'd ever met. We had biology class together in college. I was working 2 jobs to pay for school, always tired, barely staying awake in class. One day she noticed I didn't have the textbook, couldn't afford it. The next day she brought me her copy, said she'd already read it twice anyway. Sarah smiled. She was always sharing things. Yes, she was. She tutored other students for free, volunteered at the animal shelter. She could have gone to any medical school she wanted, but she stayed local because her mother was sick and needed her. Like she stayed with me when I got sick, Sarah murmured, her eyes drifting closed. Nicholas watched his daughter sleep, thinking about Emily's sacrifices, the dreams she'd given up, first for him, then for their daughter. He'd been too blind with ambition to see it then. But he saw it now with painful clarity. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, dusting the Alps with white. Christmas lights twinkled on Sarah's little tree, casting soft shadows on the wall. In that quiet moment, Nicholas Vaughan, who had spent his life chasing success, finally understood what real wealth looked like. The first week of Sarah's treatment was harder than Nicholas could have imagined. The aggressive therapy left her weak and sick, spending most of her days either sleeping or fighting waves of nausea. All Nicholas could do was hold her hand and pray. "I want to go home," Sarah whimpered one particularly bad night, her small body shaking with chills despite the warm blankets. "I know, sweetheart." Nicholas felt helpless, watching the monitors beep steadily beside her bed. "But you're so strong. You're the bravest person I know." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. It was Michael, Grace's son, in his wheelchair. At 13, he was older than Sarah, but the treatments had left him looking younger and fragile. "I brought Sarah something," he said, wheeling himself to her bedside. From his lap, he produced a hand-drawn comic book. "It's about a superhero who fights the cancer monsters. I made it when I first got here." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Can you read it to me?" As Michael read his story, complete with sound effects. That made Sarah giggle despite her discomfort. Nicholas stepped into the hallway. He needed a moment to compose himself. Grace was there as if she'd been waiting. "The first round is always the worst," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. "It gets easier." Before Nicholas could respond, his phone buzzed. Another message from Marcus. "Victoria calling emergency shareholder. Meeting. Claims to have evidence of financial misconduct." Nicholas felt his jaw clench. Victoria was playing hardball, trying to force him back to New York. She knew exactly what buttons to push. "Bad news?" Grace asked, noticing his expression. "Business. Problems, nothing important." "Ah, the outside world." Grace nodded, understanding. "It feels strange, doesn't it? How things that used to seem so crucial now feel meaningless." Just then Dr. Weber appeared, his face serious. "Mr. Vaughan, could we speak privately?" In the doctor's office, Nicholas learned that Sarah's initial response to the treatment wasn't what they'd hoped. Her body was fighting the therapy harder than expected. "We need to consider moving to Plan B," Dr. Weber said gently, "but it's even more experimental. The costs—" "Money is not an issue," Nicholas interrupted. Dr. Weber's face remained grave. "Mr. Vaughan, you should know. Your credit card was declined this morning, and our billing department received a call from your company's legal team, questioning the validity of your ability to authorize payment." Nicholas felt like he'd been slapped. Victoria wasn't just trying to take his company. She was trying to cut off his access to funds, forcing him to return to fight for control. "I'll handle it," he said firmly. "Just focus on saving my daughter." Back in Sarah's room, he found her asleep, Michael's comic book clutched to her chest. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from Hunter Gray, his longtime competitor. "Need to talk. Victoria offered merger deal. Want to hear your side first?" Nicholas stepped onto the small balcony attached to Sarah's room, the cold mountain, air biting at his face as he dialed Hunter Gray's number. "Bob, whatever Victoria told you—" "Nick," the older man interrupted, "I've known you 20 years. You're a bastard in business, but you've always been straight with me. What's really going on?" Nicholas looked through the glass door at his sleeping daughter. For the first time, he told someone the whole story, about Emily, about Sarah, about his shame and regret. There was a long silence when he finished. "My wife died of cancer 12 years ago, Hunter Gray finally said. "I was too busy building my company to spend her final months with her. It's my life's biggest regret." Another, Pause. Take care of your daughter, Nick. I'll handle Victoria. That night, as Nicholas kept his usual vigil by Sarah's bed, she woke up crying from a nightmare. I dreamed about Mommy, she said as he held her. She was in a garden telling me to be strong. But I'm so tired, Daddy. I don't know if I can fight anymore. Nicholas felt his heart breaking. Then I'll fight for you. We'll fight together. Sarah looked up at him with Emily's eyes. Will you tell me another story about Mommy? About when you were young? Nicholas settled into his chair, still holding her hand. Did I ever tell you about the time she rescued a whole box of kittens? She was supposed to meet me for a very important dinner. I was going to introduce her to some business investors. But on her way, she found these kittens abandoned in an alley. As he told the story, he remembered that night clearly. He'd been so angry when Emily hadn't shown up, hadn't answered her phone. When she finally appeared 3 hours late, covered in dirt and carrying a box of mewling kittens, he'd said terrible things about her priorities, her lack of understanding, about his ambitions. Now, watching Sarah smile at the story of her mother's kindness, Nicholas realized Emily's priorities had been right all along. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Michael was being rushed past their door on a gurney, Grace running alongside, her face tear-stained. What's happening? Sarah asked, frightened. I'm sure the doctors are taking good care of him, Nicholas assured her, but his heart was heavy. He'd seen that look on Grace's face, the same desperate fear he felt every time Sarah's monitors beeped, irregularly. Hours later, Grace appeared in their doorway. She looked exhausted but relieved. He's stable, she said before they could ask. It was close, but he's fighting. Sarah insisted on making Michael a get-well card. Though her hands shook with weakness, she carefully drew a picture of two superheroes, one in a wheelchair, one in a hospital bed, fighting cancer monsters. Together. We have to be brave together, she explained as Nicholas helped her color the picture. That's what Mommy would say. Looking at his daughter, so weak, yet so determined to help others, just like Emily, Nicholas felt a fierce surge of love and pride. Victoria could take his company, his money, everything he'd spent his life building. None of it mattered. The real treasure was right here, teaching him about courage and love and what really mattered in life. And he would move heaven and earth to make sure she got the chance to keep teaching those lessons for many years to come. Christmas was approaching, and despite the circumstances, the Hoffman Institute took on a festive atmosphere. Staff members hung garlands in the hallways, and the sound of carols drifted through the corridors. Sarah's room had become a gathering place for the other young patients, drawn by her unfailing smile and the stories her father told. But behind his cheerful facade, Nicholas was fighting battles on multiple fronts. Victoria's attempts to freeze his assets had partially succeeded, and he'd been forced to sell his personal properties to ensure Sarah's treatment could continue. His penthouse, his car collection, his vacation homes, all gone. Mr. Vaughan? A nurse interrupted his thoughts one morning. There's a woman here to see you. She says she's from Child Protective Services. Nicholas felt his blood run cold. In the doorway stood a stern-looking woman in a grey suit, holding a thick folder. I'm Karen Mitchell from New York CPS, she said crisply. We've received some concerning reports about Sarah's situation. Nicholas glanced at Sarah, still sleeping peacefully. Let's talk outside. In the hallway, Ms. Mitchell didn't waste time. We have reports that you removed a critically ill child from proper medical care in New York, that you have no legal custody rights, and that your current financial situation makes you unable to provide proper care. Who filed these reports? Nicholas demanded, though he already knew. That's confidential. But given the circumstances, we need to evaluate whether Sarah should be placed in state care back in New York. Nicholas felt the world spinning. She's my daughter. I'm trying to save her life. A daughter you never acknowledged until 2 months ago, Ms. Mitchell pointed out. No child support, no contact, nothing in 8 years. And now, suddenly you appear and take her to another country? Before Nicholas could respond, Dr. Weber appeared. Is there a problem? This is a private matter, Ms. Mitchell began, but Dr. Weber cut her off. Nothing in my clinic is private when it comes to my patients' welfare. His kind face had turned stern. Sarah Vaughan is receiving cutting-edge treatment that is her best chance for survival. Her father has been by her side every moment, providing excellent care and emotional support. If you're suggesting removing her from this facility, I must inform you that it would likely be fatal. Ms. Mitchell seemed taken aback by his directness. We have concerns about Mr. Vaughan's ability to pay. The treatment is fully funded, Dr. Weber said firmly. Mr. Hunter Gray's foundation has guaranteed all costs. Nicholas looked at the doctor in surprise. He hadn't known this. Just then, they heard Sarah's voice from inside the room. "Daddy, where are you?" "Go to her," Dr. Weber said softly. "I'll handle this." Inside, Sarah was sitting up in bed looking better than she had in days. The latest round of treatment seemed to be working. "Look what Michael helped me make." She held up a string of paper snowflakes. "Can we hang them by the window?" As Nicholas helped her decorate, his phone buzzed with a text from Hunter Gray. "Victoria tried to contact me again. Told her where to stick her merger deal. Hold on, Nick, cavalry's coming." That afternoon, while Sarah was having tests, Nicholas finally found time to thank Dr. Weber. "Bob Hunter Gray called me last week," the doctor explained. "He said he owed you for something you did 20 years ago. Something about not taking advantage of him when his wife was dying," Nicholas remembered. He could have bought Hunter Gray's company for pennies back then, when the older man was distracted by his wife's illness. But something had stopped him, perhaps a flicker of conscience he'd later buried. "I understand you've sold everything, Doctor," Weber continued. "Your homes, your cars. I'd sell my soul if it would save her. That won't be necessary." Dr. Weber smiled. "The latest tests are promising. The new treatment is working better than we hoped." For the first time in weeks, Nicholas felt hope rising in his chest. But life had taught him hope was dangerous. That evening, Michael wheeled himself into Sarah's room for their nightly story session. The two children had grown close, finding strength in each other's company. "Can you tell us about the time you and Sarah's mom went camping?" Michael asked. It had become his favorite story. Nicholas smiled, remembering that disastrous weekend. "Well, I was trying to impress Emily with my outdoor skills, which I didn't actually have." As he told the story of how they'd ended up sleeping in the car because he couldn't set up the tent, how Emily had laughed instead of getting angry, how she'd taught him to see the adventure in their misfortune, he watched Sarah's face. She was drinking in every detail about her mother, storing them like precious treasures. Later, after Michael had gone back to his room and Sarah was drifting off to sleep, she asked quietly, "Daddy, do you think Mommy would be proud of me?" Nicholas felt tears spring to his eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, she would be so proud. You're just like her, strong, brave, always thinking of others." "Sometimes," Sarah hesitated, "sometimes I feel her here, like she's watching over us." "I think she is," Nicholas said softly. "And I think she forgives me for all my mistakes." Sarah reached for his hand. She always said love was stronger than mistakes. Just then, Grace appeared in the doorway, her face glowing with excitement. "Michael's latest tests?" She was crying, but they were happy tears. "The cancer's gone. He's in remission." Sarah sat up in bed, clapping her hands weakly but joyfully. "Can we have a party? Please, Daddy." Looking at his daughter's shining face, Nicholas couldn't refuse. Soon the room was full of children in wheelchairs and hospital gowns, celebrating Michael's victory over the cancer monsters in his comic book. Watching Sarah laugh with her friends, Nicholas felt a deep peace settle over him. Victoria could take his company, his reputation, everything he'd spent his life building. But she couldn't take this moment, couldn't take the joy in his daughter's eyes or the love that filled this room. For the first time, he truly understood what Emily had tried to teach him all those years ago. Success wasn't measured in dollars or deals. It was measured in moments like these, in love given and received, in courage shown in the face of adversity, in the strength to keep going when all hope seemed lost. As the impromptu party wound down, Sarah fell asleep holding Michael's hand, a smile still on her face. Nicholas tucked the blankets around them both, then stepped out onto the balcony. The Swiss Alps glowed in the moonlight, and somewhere in that vast night sky, he felt Emily's presence. "I finally understand," he whispered to the stars. "I finally know what really matters. Just please let her live so I can spend the rest of my life showing her how much I love her." The new year arrived quietly at the Hoffman Institute, marked only by the distant sound of church bells in the valley below. Sarah had been in treatment for 6 weeks, and though the days were hard, her spirit remained unbroken. "Tell me again." "About New Year's with Mommy," she asked Nicholas as they watched fireworks explode over the mountains from her window. "She loved New Year's," Nicholas said, remembering. "She said it was like the world giving everyone a second chance. The year I met her, she made us write down all our dreams for the future and put them in balloons. We let them go at midnight." "What did you wish for?" Nicholas felt his throat tighten. "To be successful, to be rich and powerful." He looked at his daughter's face, so like Emily's. "I should have wished for love instead." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Grace, looking worried. "Nick, you need to see this." She handed him her tablet, open to a financial news website. The headline made his heart stop. Vaughan Enterprises CEO Victoria Stone announces merger with Chinese conglomerate. The article detailed how Victoria had orchestrated a deal to sell the company to a Chinese investment group, effectively ending any chance Nicholas had of regaining control. The board had approved the sale that morning. "I'm so sorry," Grace said softly. Nicholas handed the tablet back, feeling strangely calm. The company he'd spent his life building was gone, but somehow it didn't hurt as much as he'd expected. "Daddy?" Sarah's voice was concerned. "Are you okay?" "I'm perfect, sweetheart," he said, meaning it. "I have everything I need right here." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Marcus Chen arrived with a team of lawyers, their faces grave, but determined. "We can still fight this, Nick," Marcus said, spreading documents across the small table in Sarah's room. "The sale isn't final for 30 days. If we can prove Victoria acted in bad faith—" "Not here," Nicholas interrupted, seeing Sarah watching them with worried eyes. "Let's talk in the hallway." But before they could leave, Dr. Weber appeared with news that made everything else irrelevant. "The latest tests are remarkable," he said, his eyes shining with excitement. "The cancer cells are responding to treatment better than we dared hope. If this continues—" "Are you saying—" Nicholas couldn't finish the sentence, afraid to voice his hope. "We need to continue treatment." "Of course, but yes, I'm saying there's real hope now." Sarah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Does this mean I might get better? Really better?" Dr. Weber smiled warmly. "You're already showing us what better looks like, brave girl." The lawyers and their documents suddenly seemed meaningless. Nicholas sent them away with Marcus, telling them to do whatever they thought best about Victoria and the company. That afternoon, Michael came for his daily visit. Though he was in remission, he still came to the clinic for checkups, and Nicholas suspected to see Sarah. "I drew another comic," he announced, wheeling himself to Sarah's bedside. "This one's about a princess who fights dragons." "Is she brave?" Sarah asked, already reaching for the pages. "The bravest," Michael said softly, watching her face. Nicholas stepped into the hallway, giving them privacy. He found Grace there, as always. "Young love," she said with a gentle smile. "Even in a place like this." "They're too young," Nicholas protested automatically. "For romance, yes, but not for connection, not for understanding." Grace's eyes were wise. "They've both faced dragons we adults can't even imagine." Just then, Nicholas's phone buzzed, a message from Hunter Gray. "Turn," on CNN now. Finding a TV in the clinic's waiting area, Nicholas watched in astonishment as the story unfolded. Victoria Stone was being led out of Vaughan Enterprises in handcuffs, accused of fraud and embezzlement. The Chinese merger was off. "She got sloppy," Hunter Gray said when Nicholas called him. "Too eager to close the deal before anyone could look too closely at the books. My forensic accountants found irregularities going back years." "Bob, I don't know how to thank you. So just focus on that little girl of yours," the older man interrupted gruffly. "Some things are more important than business." When Nicholas returned to Sarah's room, he found her and Michael engrossed in his latest comic creation. The afternoon. Sun streamed through the window, catching the paper snowflakes they'd hung and creating tiny rainbows on the walls. "Daddy, look," Sarah held up Michael's drawing. "The princess looks just like Mommy." Nicholas looked at the sketch. a beautiful woman with flowing hair and kind eyes, standing strong against a fearsome dragon. Michael had never met Emily, but somehow he'd captured her essence perfectly. "She does," Nicholas agreed softly. "Your mommy was the strongest person I ever knew." "Until you met me," Sarah said with a cheeky grin that was pure Emily. Nicholas laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in his heart. "Yes, until I met you." That night, after Michael had gone and Sarah was sleeping peacefully, Nicholas sat in his usual chair by her bed. The monitors beeped steadily, reassuringly. Outside, snow was falling again, adding to the thick white blanket that covered the mountains. He thought about Victoria being arrested, about his company possibly being saved. A year ago, that would have been the most important news of his life. Now it barely registered compared to Dr. Weber's words about Sarah's improvement. On the bedside table sat Emily's old photo album. Sarah had been looking at it earlier, asking questions about every picture. Nicholas picked it up now, turning to a page he'd looked at 1,000 times. Emily holding newborn Sarah, her face radiant with love. "You were right," he whispered to the photograph, "about everything. About what matters, about what love really means." He looked at their sleeping daughter. "I was so blind, Emily. But she's helping me see. She's so much like you, strong and brave and full of light." Sarah stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about princesses and dragons. Nicholas tucked the blankets more securely around her, then bent to kiss her forehead. "Sweet dreams, my brave girl," he whispered. "Daddy's right here." Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the vast night, Nicholas felt Emily, smiling down on them both. In this quiet moment, in this hospital room high in the Swiss Alps, Nicholas Vaughan, former titan of industry, now simply a father, finally understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It was right here, in the peaceful breathing of his sleeping child, in the love that filled his heart until it felt like it might burst. The company might be saved, or it might not. But either way, Nicholas knew he'd never go back to being the man he was before. That man had been poor in all the ways that mattered, blind to the real treasures of life. Sarah had changed everything, had opened his eyes and his heart, had taught him what Emily had tried to show him so long ago. Love was the only wealth that truly mattered. And finally, Nicholas Vaughan was rich beyond measure. As January melted into February, the Hoffman Institute buzzed with cautious optimism. Sarah's treatment was working better than anyone had dared to hope, and her strength was slowly returning. The color was coming back to her cheeks, and she could stay awake longer each day. "She's a miracle," one of the nurses told Nicholas. "We've never seen anyone respond to the treatment quite like this." But with Sarah's improving health came increasing awareness of the world around her, including her father's sacrifices. "Daddy," she said one morning, "I heard the nurses talking. They said you sold everything to pay for my treatment. Even your house." Nicholas sat on the edge of her bed, taking her small hand in his. "Hey, don't worry about that. Those were just things. You're what matters." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But where will we live when I get better?" "We'll find a perfect little place," Nicholas assured her. "Maybe a house with a garden like the one your mummy always wanted." Just then, Michael wheeled into the room, his face glowing with excitement. "Sarah, Dr. Weber says I can take you to the solarium today if you feel strong enough. They've got new fish in the aquarium." Sarah's face lit up. "Can I go, Daddy? Please?" Watching, Michael carefully pushed Sarah's wheelchair through the clinic's halls. Nicholas felt a wave of gratitude. The two children had formed a bond that seemed to give them both strength. Michael was walking more now, though he still used the wheelchair for longer distances, and Sarah's hair was starting to grow back, soft dark fuzz like Emily's. His phone buzzed. Marcus with updates about Victoria's arrest and the company's status. The evidence against her was mounting. Years of hidden accounts, manipulated records, systematic theft disguised as business expenses. The board had formally reinstated Nicholas as CEO, but he hadn't even responded to their messages. "Mr. Vaughan," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Karen Mitchell from Child Protective Services. but her previously stern demeanor had softened considerably. "Miss Mitchell, what brings you back to Switzerland?" I needed to see for myself. She gestured toward the solarium, where Sarah was laughing at something Michael had said. "I've never been so happy to be wrong about a case." Nicholas raised an eyebrow and she continued, "I've been doing this job for 20 years, Mr. Vaughan. I've seen too many cases of wealthy parents who view their children as accessories, who delegate their care to nannies and boarding schools. When I got that report about you—" "From Victoria," Nicholas supplied. "Yes, well," Ms. Mitchell looked embarrassed. "The report painted you as a wealthy man, having a midlife crisis, endangering your sick child with experimental treatments. But what I've seen here, the way you've given up everything for her, the way you've become the father she needs," she smiled. "Let's just say my report back to the New York office will be very different from my initial assessment." In the solarium, Sarah was pressing her face close to the aquarium glass, delighting in the colorful fish. Michael was pointing out different species, reading their names from a guidebook. "Young love," Ms. Mitchell observed with a smile. "They're just children," Nicholas protested automatically. "Sometimes children understand love better than we do," she replied. "They haven't learned to complicate it yet." That evening, after a full day that had left Sarah tired but happy, Nicholas was helping her get ready for bed when she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy, do you think Mommy sent Michael to be my friend?" Nicholas paused in the middle of adjusting her pillows. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well, I was really scared when we first came here, but then I met Michael and he made me feel brave. Mommy always said angels come in different forms. Maybe she asked God to send me a special friend." Nicholas felt his throat tighten. "Your mommy was very wise, and yes, I think she's watching over you, making sure you have everything you need." "She's watching over you too, Daddy," Sarah said softly. "She knew you'd find me eventually." Before Nicholas could respond, Dr. Weber appeared in the doorway, his face serious. "Nicholas, could I speak with you?" In the hallway, the doctor's serious expression broke into a broad smile. "The latest tests are better than we could have dreamed. If this continues, Sarah could be in remission within months." Nicholas felt his knees go weak. Grace, who had been passing by, quickly helped him to a chair. "Are you sure?" he managed to ask. "As sure as we can be," Dr. Weber replied. "She'll need to stay here for at least 2 more months of treatment, and we'll want to monitor her closely." "For years?" "But yes, I believe your daughter is going to live." Nicholas buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Grace sat beside him, rubbing his back gently. "Emily," he whispered. "Oh, Emily, our baby's going to live." When he finally composed himself and returned to Sarah's room, he found her and Michael planning their future. "When I get better," Sarah was saying, "you have to come visit me in New York. Daddy says we're going to have a house with a garden. Maybe we could plant flowers," Michael suggested. "My mum says gardens need lots of colors." Nicholas cleared his throat. "Actually, I've been thinking about that." Both children looked at him expectantly. "What would you think about us staying in Switzerland? There's a lovely little house for sale in the village below. It has a garden, and it's close enough to the clinic for your checkups and—" He smiled at Michael. "Close enough for friends to visit often." Sarah's eyes grew wide. "Really? We could stay here?" "If you want to. I thought maybe it's time for a fresh start. Away from New York and all the business stuff. I could write that book I always talked about, maybe do some teaching at the local university." "But what about your company?" Sarah asked worriedly. Nicholas sat on the edge of her bed. "Someone very wise once told me that love is more important than business. It took me a long time to understand that, but I finally do." Sarah threw her arms around his neck. "Can we paint my room yellow, like sunshine? We can paint it any color you want." Michael watched them with a smile. "My mum says the house next door to ours is for sale too. It has a really big garden." Grace appeared in the doorway, trying to look stern but failing. "Michael, are you playing matchmaker?" Everyone laughed, and Nicholas felt his heart swell with joy. This was what Emily had tried to teach him all those years ago, that true happiness wasn't found in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in moments like these, surrounded by love and laughter. Later that night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, Nicholas stood on the balcony, looking at the stars. In the village below, lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and somewhere down there, was a little house that could become their home. You were right, Emily, he whispered to the night sky, about everything. And I promise you I'll spend the rest of my life being the father she deserves, loving her enough for both of us. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Nicholas smiled, remembering how Emily had always said they were signs from heaven. Whether it was a sign or not, he knew in his heart that Emily was watching, and that she approved of the man he had finally become. Spring came early to the Swiss Alps that year. By March, the snow was melting, and the first crocuses were pushing through the earth in the clinic's garden. Sarah's recovery continued to amaze her doctors, and she grew stronger every day. Nicholas had bought the little house in the village, spending his evenings there, preparing it for Sarah's eventual homecoming. Grace and Michael had indeed bought the house next door, and the two properties shared a sprawling garden that was already showing signs of new life. The roses will bloom by summer, Grace told Sarah during one of their daily visits. Just in time for your homecoming. Sarah was sitting up in bed, her dark hair now long enough to form tiny curls around her face. She looked more like Emily every day, especially when she smiled. Daddy says we can have a garden party, she said excitedly, with fairy lights and music and everyone from the clinic. The door opened, and Marcus Chen walked in carrying a large envelope. He'd been handling the aftermath of Victoria's arrest and the company's reorganization. Everything's ready for your signature, he told Nicholas. The board has approved all the changes. Sarah looked worried. Are you going back to being a businessman, Daddy? Nicholas sat on the edge of her bed. Not exactly, sweetheart. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. He opened the envelope and showed her the papers inside. I'm turning Vaughan Enterprises into a charitable foundation. Most of the money will go to helping sick children and their families, paying for treatments, helping parents who have to stop working to care for their kids. Sarah's eyes grew wide. Like Mommy had to do? Exactly like that. Nicholas squeezed her hand. No parent should have to choose between working and being with their sick child. No one should have to sell their house to pay for treatment. What will it be called? Sarah asked. The Emily Carter Foundation. Nicholas watched her face carefully. What do you think? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Mommy would love that. Just then, Michael wheeled into the room, his face glowing with excitement. Sarah, look what I can do. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up from his wheelchair and took several shaky steps toward her bed. Grace, watching from the doorway, had tears in her eyes. The physical therapy is working, she said softly to Nicholas. Dr. Weber says he might be walking full-time by summer. Sarah clapped her hands delightedly. You did it! Now we can have real dance parties in the garden. Michael blushed but looked pleased. Maybe you can teach me. Your dad says you used to take ballet lessons. Before I got sick, Sarah said, a shadow crossing her face, but it passed quickly. When I'm stronger, we can learn together. Nicholas watched the two children talking, remembering how Emily had loved to dance. She'd tried to teach him once in their tiny college apartment, laughing at his clumsy attempts to waltz. Your daughter has her mother's spirit, Marcus observed quietly, and her heart. She has her strength too, Nicholas replied. I just hope I'm worthy of them both. That afternoon, Dr. Weber brought more good news. Sarah's latest tests showed no trace of cancer cells. She would need to stay at the clinic for another month of treatment and observation, but after that she could go home. Home, Sarah repeated wonderingly. To our little house with the garden. To our little house with the garden, Nicholas confirmed, where you can get stronger every day and have friends over, and plant flowers and dance in the sunshine. And where you'll write your book? Sarah asked hopefully. Nicholas smiled. He'd started writing in the evenings, not the business book he'd always planned, but a different kind of story. A story about a little girl who taught her father how to love, and about the mother whose spirit had guided them both. Yes, I'll write my book, and maybe you can help me with it. Can I read what you've written so far? Nicholas pulled out his laptop and began to read. The morning sun illuminated the gardens of the Thompson estate, where hundreds of white flower arrangements decorated the path to the altar. Sarah listened intently, occasionally correcting details about her mother that she remembered differently. When he finished reading, she was quiet for a moment. It's a love story, she said finally. Yes, it is. But not just about you and Mommy. It's about all kinds of love. Nicholas marveled at his daughter's wisdom. You're right. It's about how love can change us, heal us, make us better than we were. Like how Mommy's love helped you find me, Sarah said softly, and how your love helped me get better. And how you taught me what love really means, Nicholas added, kissing her forehead. That evening, the clinic staff organized a small celebration in the solarium. Sarah, wearing a new pink dress Grace had brought her, sat in a comfortable chair surrounded by her friends. Michael had managed to walk the entire distance from his room, though he was tired now and sitting in his wheelchair again. Dr. Weber raised a glass of sparkling cider. To our miracle girl, he said, smiling at Sarah. And to the power of love, to heal what medicine alone cannot. As the others chatted and laughed, Nicholas stepped out onto the balcony. The air was warm with the promise of spring, and the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Emily, he whispered, I wish you could see her. She's so much like you, strong and brave and full of love. I promise you, I'll spend every day of my life being worthy of her, worthy of the gift you gave me. Daddy, Sarah's voice called from inside. Come back in. Michael's going to teach everyone the dance he learned in physical therapy. Nicholas smiled and turned back to the warmth and laughter inside. The past few months had taught him that sometimes the hardest challenges bring the greatest blessings, and that true love never dies. It just changes form, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. In the solarium, Sarah was attempting to teach Michael a ballet move, both of them laughing at their awkward efforts. Grace was chatting with Dr. Weber, while other patients and staff members watched the impromptu dance lesson with smiles on their faces. This, Nicholas realized, was what Emily had tried to show him all those years ago. That success wasn't measured in dollars or deals, but in moments of joy, in connections made, in love given and received. And by that measure, he was finally truly rich. The summer evening was perfect for a garden party. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees, and the scent of roses filled the air. The garden between Nicholas and Grace's houses had been transformed into a magical space, with small tables scattered among the flowers and a dance floor set up on the lawn. It was exactly 6 months since Sarah had left the Hoffman Institute, and 3 months since her last test had confirmed she remained cancer-free. The party was both a celebration of her recovery and a reunion. Many of their friends from the clinic had come to join them. Sarah, wearing a yellow sundress that matched the roses she and Michael had planted, was showing Tommy, now fully recovered. Around the garden, her dark curls bounced as she walked, her face glowing with health and happiness. And these are the strawberries Michael and I planted, she was saying. They're just starting to turn red. Nicholas watched from the patio, his heart full. The past few months had brought changes he could never have imagined a year ago. His book about Emily and Sarah had been published to unexpected success, touching hearts around the world. The Emily Carter Foundation was already helping hundreds of families cope with childhood cancer, and Victoria's trial had ended with a lengthy prison sentence. But the biggest changes were the smallest ones, teaching Sarah to ride a bike, helping her with homework, watching her and Michael tend their garden. The simple, precious moments of being a father. Penny for your thoughts, Grace said, joining him with 2 glasses of lemonade. Just thinking about how much can change in a year. He accepted the glass gratefully. Did you ever imagine when we first met at the clinic that we'd end up being neighbors? Grace smiled, watching Michael demonstrate his now perfect walking abilities by chasing Tommy around the garden. Life has a way of surprising us. Speaking of which, she held out her left hand, where a simple gold band sparkled on her ring finger. Nicholas hugged her tightly. Bob finally asked, when did this happen? Last night. Grace blushed. He said watching Michael recover made him realize life's too short to waste time. Bob Hunter Gray had become a frequent visitor to their little community, his gruff exterior softening notably around the children. His foundation had merged with the Emily Carter Foundation, creating a powerful force for helping families affected by childhood illness. Daddy, Sarah called out, Dr. Weber is here. The doctor made his way through the garden, accepting hugs from his former patients. He'd become much more than a doctor to all of them. He was family now. "Sarah," he said warmly, "you look more like your mother every time I see you." It was true. At 9 years old, Sarah was growing into a beautiful girl with Emily's gentle spirit and kind heart. Nicholas often found himself staring at her, seeing Emily in her smile, her gestures, the way she cared for others. "Come see my roses, Dr. Weber," Sarah insisted, pulling him toward the flower beds. "Michael and I grew them ourselves, and look, I'm almost as tall as the measuring mark Daddy made on the doorframe last month." As the evening progressed, more guests arrived. Marcus Chen, who now ran the business side of the foundation. Mrs. Thompson, the nurse who had first helped Sarah find her father. Even Karen Mitchell from CPS came, bringing a garden gnome as a housewarming gift. When the sun began to set, Nicholas called everyone's attention. "Sarah and I have a surprise for you all." Sarah ran to join him, practically bouncing with excitement. Together they unveiled a small bronze plaque mounted on the garden wall. "The Emily's Garden, Children's Haven, a place of healing, hope, and love in memory of Emily Carter, and in honor of all brave children fighting their battles. We're turning the big house at the end of the street into a holiday home," Nicholas explained. "A place where families can come while their children are receiving treatment at the clinic, somewhere they can be together, surrounded by beauty and peace." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Dr. Weber raised his glass. "To Emily's garden." "To Emily's garden," everyone echoed. As the stars began to appear, Michael approached Sarah somewhat shyly. "Would you like to dance?" "I've been practicing." Sarah took his hand and they moved to the dance floor. Nicholas watched as they swayed to the music, two young survivors who had found strength in each other. "They're so young," Grace said softly, "but they understand things about life and love that some adults never learn." Nicholas nodded, thinking of how long it had taken him to learn those lessons himself. On the dance floor, Sarah was teaching Michael the basic ballet positions she'd recently relearned, both of them laughing at their mistakes. Looking around the garden at all the faces, some healthy, some still bearing the marks of illness, all filled with joy, Nicholas felt Emily's presence strongly. She would have loved this, he thought. The garden, the laughter, the way their daughter had bloomed like the roses she tended so carefully. Sarah caught his eye and waved him over. "Dance with us, Daddy." As Nicholas joined his daughter on the dance floor, she whispered, "Mommy would love this party." "Yes, she would, sweetheart. Do you think she's watching?" Nicholas looked up at the stars twinkling above the garden. "I know she is, and I know she's very, very proud of you." Sarah leaned her head against his chest. "And of you too, Daddy. She always believed you'd find your way back to love." Nicholas held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of roses and summer evening. Around them, their friends and family laughed and talked, children played among the flowers, and love, in all its many forms, filled the garden like a tangible presence. A year ago, he had been Nicholas Vaughan, billionaire CEO, a man who thought he had everything but in reality had nothing that truly mattered. Now in this garden filled with love and healing, he was simply Sarah's father, and he was rich beyond measure. As the moon rose over the Swiss Alps, casting silver light over Emily's garden, Nicholas silently thanked his first love for giving him his greatest gift, their daughter, who had taught him how to love again. And somewhere, in the gentle summer breeze that rustled the roses, he felt Emily's answer, a reminder that love, true love, never dies. It just transforms like the seasons, like the flowers in the garden, like a father's heart learning to bloom again,